So if we sort of take a step back and look what's happened in recent history, obviously we had our own independence referendum in 2014, where by a margin of 55% to 45%, we voted to stay in the UK. And at that point, the UK, although we sort of knew by that point that we may be heading for a referendum about European Union membership, we were very much still in the European Union. But so we voted to stay in the UK. Fast forward about 18 months, nearly 2 years, and obviously we had in June 2016, we had the referendum about the UK's membership of the European Union, and we voted to come out of the European Union as the UK. Now, the problem with some of that is that when you look at voting patterns in Scotland, actually we voted in Scotland very much to stay in the European Union by almost a factor of 2 to 1. So 62% of us voted to stay in the European Union, and 38% of us voted to come out. So, in other words, as the politicians would say, we are being dragged out of the EU against our will and against the express wishes of the people of Scotland. So that's the background to it. That, the democratic outrage, as the First Minister would say, and there is kind of good reason for that, I think. And I think what she calculated was that because almost 2/3 of us had voted to stay in the European Union, the fact that we were being dragged out would mean that people would support her call for another independence referendum. But in actual fact, that hasn't happened, and both support for independence hasn't really changed significantly since 2014, and support for a second independence referendum, so for actually holding another referendum, has never been above, in the short term, has never been above 50%. So in other words, I think the government in Scotland sort of miscalculated actually the strength of voters' feelings. So even though I think for a lot of people, well, they don't want to be, that they are being dragged out of the EU against their will, it didn't necessarily mean in their minds that what they wanted as a result of that was another independence referendum. So because of the election that happened this year, and the fact that the SNP lost quite a few, about 21, 22 seats, at least in the short term, there isn't going to be another independence referendum in Scotland.
Scotland didn't vote for Brexit. It was 62% for Remain, 38%, which was higher than some expected, for Leave, and that was across the whole country. You couldn't point to any council areas where there was a Leave vote, and according to opinion polls, those numbers have gone up a bit to around 66% Remain. So I think the sort of constitutional and political issue of Scotland being very out of sync with English and Welsh politics, at least, is quite an important one. I mean, before the referendum, the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, said that she felt constitutionally Scotland should have a veto as one of the constituent parts of the UK. And not surprisingly, that wasn't given.
The last sort of 15, 20 years has seen a real sort of political sea change, particularly in Scotland. And I don't think while that is the case, it was a UK referendum and you go by the UK result, in a sense, sort of politically and almost culturally, we have sort of moved on from that now, and you can't expect. Well, you can try and implement the result as it pertains to the whole of the UK. You can't expect to do that without people in different parts of the UK saying, "Well, hang on a sec, we didn't vote for this," and whether that's in Wales, whether that's in this case Scotland or Northern Ireland. Now, Northern Ireland at the moment, there is no, as we speak, there is no government, so finding their voice in this is a little bit more difficult. Whereas we in Scotland have a government, we have a strong government. It's been in power for 10 years. It's extremely pro-European. There wasn't a single politician from the SNP, either at Westminster, Holyrood, or in local government, who during the campaign stood for leaving. Some of them since the referendum have come out as leavers, but during the referendum, not a single SNP politician despite the fact that about a third of SNP voters voted for leave, which is a separate issue. So it is unsurprising that the weight of the Scottish Government, which is, I think, sort of taken much more seriously these days, was put behind the position of, we really don't want this to happen. This is a democratic outrage. And if we can't stop it happening, then we're jolly well going to try and have our voice heard and make sure that the sort of, as I was saying earlier, the different kind of political and economic conditions in Scotland are taken into account during the negotiation period. As far as the relationship between Scotland and the EU and Scotland and the UK is concerned, the Scottish Government pretty much accepts that Brexit is happening, albeit reluctantly. But what it wants to do is to try and explore ways in which the deal for Scotland, in terms of the final deal that the UK negotiates with the European Union in March 2019, can be different, can be bespoke, can take into account economic factors and political factors in Scotland as opposed to the rest of the UK. So, to give an example, the Scottish Government doesn't want to end free movement of people. The Scottish Government wants to encourage more people from Europe and beyond to come and work and live in Scotland. Now, these are kind of partly political considerations because the Scottish Government wants a much more diverse society, but actually there are economic considerations here too. And if the UK leaves the EU without a deal and we end freedom of movement, the Scottish Government is worried that there will be an impact on the Scottish economy because we no longer have people from Europe coming here and doing certain jobs. So there are kind of political and practical elements to this. So the Scottish Government accepts that Brexit is happening, but really wants a different deal.
We want to make sure the aerospace sector, as well as financial services, as well as manufacturing and engineering, our export trades, our whisky industry, and a whole range of other industries that we depend on, we must make sure they are fully protected and we can continue to trade with the European Union on a free trade basis, essentially, would be the absolute ideal. I think the other important point in all of this is, particularly in relation to the trade deal, I think we should seek agreement from the European Union that if and when Scotland votes for independence, then the successor state of Scotland will be entitled to the deal that's reached, subject to any future negotiation, obviously, by mutual agreement, but we should be entitled to get the same deal as an independent country as that negotiated by the UK.
I think it's been fascinating to see how the EU27 have changed their attitude overall. I mean, these are 27 different countries and Brussels, but how they've changed their attitude overall to Scotland since Scotland voted to stay, and it voted by a larger majority than Northern Ireland to stay. So whereas in 2014 the EU leaders and Brussels too were very concerned about Scottish independence, and you had the then head of the Commission, Barroso, giving scary warnings about how long it might take to join the EU if Scotland went independent. And what you saw was a very warm attitude to Scotland after the vote in June 2016. And Nicola Sturgeon went to Brussels. She was greeted by Juncker. The fact that he met her speaks political volumes.
So there is a thing called the Joint Ministerial Committee, which the Scottish Government's Europe Minister, Mike Russell, sits on. There are also meetings between the First Minister and the Prime Minister, and also the First Minister of Wales and Northern Ireland, in terms of, how do we kind of nuance the deal to meet the needs of the devolved nations in the UK. But the worry, particularly in Scotland, is that that's not being taken seriously enough, and actually our voice here is being sort of subsumed into the kind of hard Brexit type talk that's happening down south, and that's a real and legitimate, I would argue, concern for the Scottish Government.